We've agreed that quarantine is the right way to go in this regard, and we will work out the particulars of where this particular individual will be quarantined, whether it'll be in New Jersey or New York. But it's the first application of this new set of standards that we have developed over the last 24 hours and now have had the opportunity to implement.
We've been working on it for a whole day, so you know it's going to be good. New Jersey Governor Chris Christie on Friday announcing New Jersey's new and controversial Ebola quarantine policy. The governor announced a mandatory quarantine for people who had been to West Africa, even if they had no symptoms of Ebola, a 21-day quarantine. But then he changed his mind. His first test case for his new policy was sent home to Maine after only 3 days. And in part because Chris Christie is a very high-profile governor, and in part because he announced his new standards in bombastic political terms, that quarantine announcement and then that cave over implementing it got a ton of attention over the past few days. But New Jersey was not the first state to do something like this. It has been a much lower-profile thing, but the first mandatory Ebola quarantine was actually put in place by the state of Connecticut under a policy announced just under 3 weeks ago. Connecticut, as best as we can tell, has approximately 8 people under mandatory quarantine orders tonight. Yale University PhD student Ryan Boyko is one of them. He traveled to Liberia to help the Liberian Ministry of Health set up a computer database to help them in their fight against Ebola. Since returning to Connecticut, Mr. Boyko has tested negative for Ebola, but under state orders of the state government in Connecticut, he has been quarantined at home for the past 12 days and counting, with an armed police officer standing guard outside his door. He has decided now to talk publicly about his quarantine for the first time. Joining us via Skype from his mandatory quarantine inside his apartment is Ryan Boyko in Connecticut. Mr. Boyko, thanks very much for being with us tonight. I appreciate your decision to talk with us.
Hi, well, thanks for having me on.
So, first of all, what were you doing in Liberia? How long were you there, and what were you working on?
I was there for 3 weeks, and I was helping them build their contact tracing system. So contact tracing is essentially just identifying and following up with everyone who's been in contact with somebody who later tested positive for Ebola. And in every other epidemic, contact tracing and then immediately isolating those contacts that become sick is what ended the epidemic. And so it's just the same thing should apply to this epidemic. It's just larger and requires more effort now.
When you were there working on those data-based solutions, trying to help them in that side, the administrative side of their response, were you in direct contact with people who were sick, or were you around dead bodies at all? Were you in sort of a frontline setting at all while you were there?
No, it was remarkably mundane for what you might imagine, but basically just going from a hotel to the Ministry of Health, where I worked in an IT office most of the time, and back to the hotel to eat and go to bed, basically every day.
So, as I understand it, you left Liberia on October 10th, so 2.5 weeks ago. When you came back to Connecticut, when you came back to the United States, as far as I understand it, you weren't immediately put into quarantine. You were put into quarantine several days after you got back. What happened there? Why did the state decide to quarantine you?
I arrived back on a Saturday, and on that Wednesday, I had a low-grade fever that eventually wound up getting to 100.2. And so I was in contact with physicians at Yale Health per the protocol, and they made the decision to send me to the hospital for testing for Ebola. And that made the news, and the governor actually had a press conference for Ebola already planned the next afternoon. And so it was just serendipity, I suppose, that the timing was such that the governor felt like he could make a political point, I think, by instituting the quarantines then.
Well, once you were symptomatic, having been where you were and having been working on what you'd been working on, were you worried that you might have contracted Ebola? Did you, when you got that low-grade fever, were you worried about your own health?
It's the thought occurs to you, but I really wasn't very concerned. I knew that I had no contacts that should have given me Ebola, and it really is. It's spread by direct contact with bodily fluids with very sick and dead individuals. So I wasn't very concerned, but the thought, crossed my mind, and it was certainly a great relief for my mom, especially when the negative test result came back.
So you got a negative test result. While you went through that process, the state of Connecticut issued you a mandatory quarantine order, which was not specific to you being symptomatic, not specific to the results of your blood test. It was, what was the order, and what did it tell you to do?
No, it wasn't, and it applied actually also to a colleague of mine who went with me and was never exhibited any symptoms. At the time the governor had that press conference, he released a statement that said that everyone coming to Connecticut from those three countries would be quarantined, and it seems like he's been following through on that policy ever since then.
What is the circumstance of your quarantine? Obviously, you're in your own apartment. I've been told that there's a police officer standing outside your door to make you think otherwise if you decide to leave or if anybody decides to visit you. But what are the circumstances? What can you do and what can't you do? And what's it been like for this past almost 2 weeks?
Yeah, so I can't have visitors. I can't leave. So it's very isolating, as you might imagine, and you can't you can't do most of your exercise. You can't go to work. You can't visit friends, family, anything like that. And yeah, it's just been hard. And just like what happened in New Jersey, it wasn't clear right away what was happening, or there was a miscommunication, I think, between the state and the local officials and the police and everyone, and just like what happened with New Jersey. So I was actually kept in the hospital for a whole extra day after the hospital wanted to release me. And during that time, doctors would come shake my hand. All of the medical staff there had no concerns about getting Ebola. In fact, they were joking that I'm the only person in New Haven that they could say for sure did not have Ebola. Right. But the state, of course, had different ideas.
As lots of other states are rolling out policies like this, it has been very low profile that Connecticut has pursued this policy. Very few people knew before tonight that you were in quarantine or that your colleague is in quarantine, or that indeed a handful of other people in the state are in these mandatory quarantines. Lots of states are rolling out new policies like this. I guess I just have to ask you, bottom line, as somebody who's experiencing this, as somebody who's very concerned about the spread of this disease and the public health implications here, is there any reason to think that people are more safe in Connecticut because you're locked in your apartment right now than if you were self-monitoring and ready to call authorities if you showed symptoms at some point, showed symptoms again, or if your colleague showed symptoms?
No, there's no scientific evidence to suggest that people are more safe. In fact, they're less safe because this policy makes it harder for healthcare workers and others to go to West Africa. People, as you pointed out in the start of your show, it's a patchwork of regulations that are constantly shifting, and people don't know what to expect when they come back. And most of these healthcare workers go for about 4 weeks. And so when you tack on a 3-week quarantine after that, you're nearly doubling the amount of time that they have to take off work, that they have to avoid their families and avoid the rest of their life. And for many people, they just can't do that. And so it's going to result in fewer volunteers going and more spread of the disease in West Africa, which is going to result in more cases here.
Yale University PhD student Ryan Boyko quarantined for 12 days now under state orders in Connecticut despite testing negative for Ebola. As he mentioned, he is probably the only person in Connecticut with a surefire blood test guarantee that he's negative because he's got that test, but nevertheless in quarantine. Mr. Boyko, thanks for joining us tonight. I know it's not an easy decision to go public about these things, but I appreciate you being here.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. I should tell you that we asked the Connecticut Governor's Office for a statement about Mr. Boyko tonight, and they told us this. They told us, quote, "The protocols are not a punishment. We're operating out of an abundance of caution to limit any potential public health risks." The question is whether or not it makes public health sense. All right. Lots more ahead from here in San Francisco tonight. Just how much local government can one of the richest corporations on earth buy for itself? A test case coming up just a moment.